Thank you for listening to this episode of History Exchange.
Danke, dass Sie wieder dabei sind bei dieser Episode von History Exchange.
Further information can be found on Center Austria's homepage www.centeraustria.org.
Und auf der Homepage des Instituts für Zeitgeschichte der Universität Innsbruck www.uibk.ac.at/Zeitgeschichte.
My name is Jeff Morrison. I am here at the University of New Orleans Library interviewing Dr. Gerald Steinacher. Is that the correct pronunciation? I've been practicing it.
Absolutely correct. But you know what? Whatever you use, it's okay. You know, you could say Steinacher. That's what people in Nebraska would probably pronounce it. By the way, Steinacher is a pretty common family name in Nebraska because of the immigration history. And in Italy, Steinacher, and in Austria, Steinacher. So it's all good. Works for me.
And so why don't you let us, let the audience know about yourself and your professional career?
Yeah, so I grew up on the Italian-Austrian border in the Tyrol region, and I was always very much interested in history. So since early childhood, that's what I can remember. And very early on, I told my parents I want to do something with history, Korean history of sorts, something connected with history to make a living. And that's what I did. So in school, I was a little bit of a history nerd. And then I decided to go to the university and went to the universities of Innsbruck and Trento. And once I had my master's degree, or magister, as they called it back then in German-speaking countries, I came to New Orleans, which was an absolute game changer for me and really opened my world. But maybe we can talk about this a little bit more later. And then I got my PhD, worked in South Tyrol. So for people who are not familiar where that is, that in Italy, northern Italy, on the Austrian border, and it's mostly German-speaking region. And that's where I lived for almost 15 years and worked there. In 2006, I was a fellow at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. Many of the listeners will be familiar with that institution. Wonderful museum, very important, with a huge impact in educating people on the Holocaust and anti-Semitism and other genocides as well. And then at some point, I decided to move to the United States. I was very lucky to be first a visiting fellow and then a research professor at Harvard University. Some people might have heard of Harvard. Well, after 2 years, my postdoc, also Habilitation, as it is called in German, was translated by Oxford University Press and was pretty successful, I think, for an academic book. Won a National Jewish Book Award soon after the publication. And then I went on the job market and eventually, accepted a position as tenured professor, also tenure track professor, of course, at the beginning at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, which has a long history of Holocaust studies and Jewish studies. The University of Nebraska Press has a great reputation publishing in that area. And that was 2011. And then after a few years, of course, I got tenure, and I'm now a full professor. I'm a James A. Rowley Professor of History at the moment, and a JED professor here. And my focus is Holocaust studies and fascism, also German, Austrian National Socialism and Italian fascism, Holocaust studies, and in recent years, always more the history of anti-Semitism. So that kind of summarizes it. And just to make one last point, so when I told you that I always had an interest in history since I was little, it was particularly Renaissance history and medieval history. But because of events in Austria and in Italy, in Europe, in the late 80s, early 1990s, I changed my focus to contemporary history, as a recent issues like dealing with the Nazi past and the fascist past, especially in Austria. And so that's why or how I became a Holocaust historian, but my heart, or a piece of my heart, is still with medieval and Renaissance history.
Yeah, very understandable. Changing up what you're fascinated by in history in the same way, and that's very, very impressive career that you have. And also, I want to thank you for taking time out of your day. Let's say at the beginning. Thank you for taking time out of your day to conduct this interview with us.
You're welcome. This is very important because one of the things I feel strongly about is mentoring the next generation. So I feel very strongly about my students, all my students, but especially my graduate students. And as an advisor, I really feel the responsibility to help them and make sure that they are going to achieve their goals and can turn their passion into a profession, just like me. But in order to do that, you need people who help you along the way. I always was fortunate enough to run into people like that in middle school, high school, at the university, and then later on in life. And Günther Bischof, of course, was one of the people who helped me very much, had a huge impact on me, and is to this very day a wonderful mentor. I cannot thank him enough for everything he did for me and for so many others. And so I want to give that to others. I want to hand that on, what I learned, what was given to me, not just taking it, but also passing it on to a new generation. So I will feel very strongly about that. And so I'm very glad that we're talking about all of those things and our friend Günther Bischof today.
And going off of that, since both you and Dr. Günther Bischof are from Austria, you believe that similarity in a sense helped you, like, trying to think of how to word this here, helped you kind of understand how, did it help you, I'm sorry, I'm at a loss for words right now.
Yes, I mean, growing up.
Yeah, did it help you, like, having that that commonality, did it help you follow his footsteps? That's what I meant to say. And also, since you all study similar topics, did that also help you pretty much nail down your field of study?
Yes, I think that the upbringing coming from a society, the Austrian society, where we both grew up, and then also seeing the issues, the struggles that this society was dealing with after 1945, and then especially in the 1980s, in the 1990s, which was finally coming to terms, or at least trying to come to terms, to address more openly the question of guilt and responsibility. Because after 1945, there was this narrative, the Austrians as first victims of Nazi aggression, and the image was, or the official narrative was, the Austrians, they were all victims of the Nazis, and it was all the Germans, and the Austrians really have nothing to do with the crimes of the Third Reich and the Holocaust. And of course, this was a very one-sided narrative. And in the 1980s and the 1990s, this all basically fell apart. Like in so many other societies after the end of the Cold War, the logics of the Cold War, who put all these issues on ice after 1945, those logics were disappearing after the Cold War was over, and many societies had to answer very tough questions. Not just the Austrians, but also Italians, the Swiss, Argentinians, the French, many other nations. For me particularly, I said initially that I always had a passion for history, but it was more medieval and Renaissance history, because growing up in Tyrol, if you have ever been to Tyrol, it's full of castles. I mean, Scotland is amazing, very different, but in South Tyrol and the Trentino also, there are castles everywhere. And so it's not a surprise that I was fascinated by the history of those places. I wanted to know more of the societies and those generations who lived in those places, and medieval towns and early modern towns as the 16th century. But in the 1980s, there was a huge controversy in Austria when Kurt Waldheim, who was the former Secretary General of the United Nations, he was a pretty prominent figure, not just on the Austrian level, national level, but internationally, because he was, United Nations Secretary General. That's something. So people knew who he was outside of Austria too. And he ran in the 1980s for the office of Austrian president, which doesn't have the role of the American president. I mean, the most powerful political figure in Austria is the prime minister or the chancellor. But in any case, it's an important office. And when he was running for office, questions were raised about his wartime past, his wartime record. What did he do during the Second World War? Where was he stationed? It soon became clear that he was not very truthful, to put it mildly, about his record during the Second World War. So when he was stationed on the Balkans, as in Yugoslavia, he had a lot of knowledge about the atrocities committed there, but he denied that, basically. Also downplayed, of course, his membership in Nazi organizations and so on. But his justification was, I'm oversimplifying now, but to make a long story short, what's the problem? I just did my duty as a soldier of the German army, in Hitler's army, to be precise, like millions of others. I just followed orders. And crimes were committed, yes, but it was not my responsibility. The higher-ups, the officers, the leaders, they are responsible, not me. And the younger generation, like myself, said, this is not acceptable. This is not the way you can deal with the past. You have a responsibility. You can say, yeah, I was involved. I was drafted into the army like other people. I was sucked into this. Horrible crimes are committed. And I condemned the Nazi regime, this dictatorship, this genocidal regime. I wish I had not been part of this at all, but I was, a child of my time, and I hope that these horrible times will never come again. That's not what he said. There were really clashes between the generations, also inside families. Talking about polarization nowadays, when you look at many societies, including the American society, very polarized, right? About many issues, also along political lines in society and history and so on and so on. History is often very political. It was also in the 80s in Austria, and I remember, also in my family, I had some rough talks with my own father and family members about these issues. And I realized at some point, okay, there's so much work to do. We have, as a society, we have to take this on. We have to address this. We have to look into this. I compare it sometimes. It's not a good comparison, but I say it anyway, because no comparison is perfect, especially not in comparing the crimes of the Second World War, the Holocaust, or the Nazi regime. But I say, well, it's like, if you're not dealing with the past, with these horrible crimes, with horrible things that happen in your society by members of your society, maybe by, your ancestors, committed by your ancestors or some of them. It's like, if you ignore that, if you try to be silent to it, push it under the carpet, it's like ignoring cancer a little bit. It's like the cancer of the society. And ignoring cancer probably is not going to heal it. It's not going to go away somehow by very rarely, right? There would be a miracle happens, but it's very rare. Most of the time, it makes you sick and maybe, it's going to kill you. So I felt a responsibility, despite my passion for medieval history and Renaissance, and not for the last century or the last 100 years, to have or to contribute, to do my little contribution to the healing of the society. And even foremost, of course, for me, the interest in the victims. I mean, this is trying, to do some kind of, it's impossible. You cannot undo the suffering, the murder of it's impossible. But maybe for the survivors and for future generations, you can at least show a symbolic act that you're willing to address those issues and name those issues and don't try to hush them up, and to have at least moral responsibility, even as a younger generation who, of course, was not personally involved at all. It's maybe not guilt that the younger generation was not born yet in those years, but maybe a moral responsibility. That's how I see it. That's my personal view. And so that's how I started. And when I lived in Italy, when I studied in Italy, I realized Italian society is different, of course, there's a different history, but there are many parallels to what was happening in Austria, not dealing with the legacy of Italian fascism in so many ways, which was also kind of kept under lock and key for the most part, under ice during the Cold War, everything on ice, these issues. And so that's why I started also to have an interest in Italian fascism. And like with the Bischof, it very much pointed me, still to this very day, that I grew up in the Austrian society, at least in part, and the issues and the challenges there. Absolutely. Otherwise, I would probably do something else.
From your perspective, what difficulties have you encountered when researching said Nazis after World War II, like when they're on the run?
Right.
Are they actively trying to hide their tracks, actively trying to destroy records? And how have you been able to overcome that?
Yeah, that's a very good question too. The thing is, there are many surprising findings, at least surprising sometimes to myself, but certainly to a wider audience when I give talks and tell them about my research, that the escape of Nazi perpetrators after 1945, especially the ones who escaped to overseas, who left Europe in order to avoid trial and punishment, avoid being put on, war crimes trials like Nuremberg or denazification courts, that this escape between 1946 and 1950-51, also 5-6 years even after the end of the Second World War, when these things unfolded, was not a secret at all. Also by 1947, 1948, and that's the peak of people escaping mostly through Italy to South America or Canada, the United States, the Middle East, all those countries. When that happened, you could read it in the newspapers. The Italian newspapers, the Austrian newspapers, the German newspapers, and so on. They reported to a certain detail about what's going on and how these people get out of Europe and how they escape justice. But at that point, as I said, 47, 48, 49, the Cold War was already starting to be in full swing. You had the Berlin blockade in 1948, the communist takeover in Czechoslovakia in 1948. You had then the war, of course, in Korea in 1950, and then war crimes trials and denazification and all this was wrapped up because there were new priorities. Putting perpetrators on trial was not the priority anymore. The priority was fighting communism, and the Nazis were one thing for sure. They were anti-communist. So you had an enemy in common, and the enemy of the enemy is maybe not your friend, but a potential ally. And so a cynical trade-off kind of was made by many people, including the intelligence services, but also the military, the political leaders. Are these people, these Nazis, including war criminals and fascists, more useful? Is it more useful for us to put them on trial, to hold them responsible for their crimes, to punish them, or should we recycle them for the Cold War? Like if somebody, to illustrate the case, like the famous case of Klaus Barbie, who was the head of the Gestapo in Lyon in Nazi-occupied France, and he was a brutal torturer. So he arrested resistance fighters, Jews. He had a reputation. He was really a sadist. He was really. After the war, the French authorities, he was one of the most wanted people in France because of his crimes committed there. They looked for him desperately while he was in American custody. And the American intelligence decided at some point not to extradite him to the French to the stand trial, but to use him as an intelligence asset against the communists in Germany and France. And then once he was not useful anymore, he had his part, basically, he was channeled off to South America with a new identity. So those are the logics of the Cold War. And in terms of records, at some point, people were not very careful hiding the identity. Many of these Nazi perpetrators traveled under their real names, their real identities. Not always, but overall, it's not so difficult to reconstruct their escape. In some cases, it's a little bit of a detective work, but in many cases, it's not.
So, going off of that, how do you feel that these trials were not gone through with to both the Soviet Union and the United States? And do you have any research on that? And if so, has there been any pushback on said research?
I'm not sure I understood your question correctly. Maybe you can rephrase it for me.
I was talking about specifically the Nazi scientists, right?
Oh yeah.
Do you believe that? I mean, well, never mind. You believe that they that the trial that they would have been put on were not gone through because they were using them for the Cold War instead.
Yeah,
that's what I was trying to add.
Yeah, absolutely. So to understand Nazi escape, you can only understand it on the background of the early Cold War. If you don't know what the early Cold War is and the dynamics, the logics of that time period between the big players, you will not understand Nazi escape and how that unfolded and why it was even possible. Because the one thing I should say, I mean, by 1947, so when early 1947, actually, when these Nazi escape structures always more materialized, most of these people went through Austria, by the way, and then Italy to overseas ports, because at the time people would not fly, but they would take a ship from Genoa, because Genoa is the very northern port, northern Italy, very close from Austria, from southern Germany. When these structures materialized, the Allies very soon discovered those. So they could have easily shut down the whole thing. Adolf Eichmann or Joseph Mengele would have never made it out of Europe because, again, keep the timing in place. Mengele, I think, escaped in 1949. Eichmann in 1950, also 3 years after the Allies discovered what's going on and how this system works of Nazi escape, these structures. And Klaus Barbie, I mentioned him earlier, the Nazi perpetrator, Gestapo chief of Lyon in France. He escaped in 1951. So the Allies could have easily shut it down, but they decided not to because they saw some benefit for them in these structures that they could use on the background of the early Cold War. And of course, the hiring of experts of any kind, from the intelligence community, people who had real knowledge or about the communists, or at least pretended to have great knowledge and expertise, like Klaus Barbie, they were hired, but also experts, technical experts, engineers, people who designed new weapons, rockets, planes. All of that was of great interest to the various Allied nations, and not just the Americans hired, experts like Wernher von Braun and his group, but also the Soviets, tried to get hold on German experts, and the British and the French, everyone, the Argentinians too. I mean, the one reason why Argentina was so popular for Nazis and fascists after 1945 was that Perón, the head of state in Argentina in those years, wanted German experts, technicians, German know-how, to modernize his army. So he did what everybody else was trying to do, and so it makes all sense once you keep the Cold War back. It doesn't take away the fact, understanding is not justifying. I understand what happened back then because I studied these structures for many years now. I have been studying these structures for many years now, but it doesn't mean this is justified what these people did. Protecting some of the worst mass murderers, one of the worst criminals in human history, out of a cost-benefit logic and political or military considerations. This is not cannot be justified. And in the 1980s, when Klaus Barbie was on trial, he was extradited from South America, one of the few cases, and he was put on trial in Lyon. the city where he committed his crimes, mainly where his headquarters were during the war, the U.S. involvement of shielding him and protecting him from French justice became known and public, and the U.S. government had to apologize to the French people, to the French nation, for their role in obstructing justice. But of course, we all understand there is no perfect justice. And Stuart Eisenstadt, in his report about Switzerland and the role of Switzerland in the Second World War, he titled his book Imperfect Justice. And I think that's very appropriate, because after 1945, after all those crimes committed, after this worst war in human history, after dictatorship and genocide, how it's impossible to have perfect justice. You cannot bring the people back who were murdered, the suffering and the trauma of the survivors. How do you repair, between quotation marks, those wounds? It's impossible, really. I mean, there were some attempts to do that. And then, of course, about criminal justice, punishing perpetrators. Who are the perpetrators? How many can you put on trial? I mean, given the widespread involvement of people on various levels and to various degrees, it's not very realistic, even if you would like to do that, to put millions of people on trial. I mean, this kind of infrastructure, who has that? And then, of course, practical considerations also in running the country, when so many university professors, doctors, policemen, nurses, you name it, in the society, were somehow part of the regime, the criminal regime, involved in some form and to some degree. And it's impossible to fire them all from their jobs. I mean, the society would collapse. So very difficult choices have to be made. We have to keep that in mind as well. You know, when you think about the field that is very popular nowadays and extremely interesting and relevant, very relevant to the issues we face today, of transitional justice, how to transition from war to peace and from a dictatorship to democracy like West Germany, Austria, and Italy after the war.
One of my other questions is regarding your work at the United States Holocaust Museum. Did it help you further your interest in your topic of research? And, in what aspect of that also helped you want to further your topic of research?
Yeah, I mean, I was fellow at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in 2006, and I mean, it's an amazing institution to work there. And not just the museum part, but for me, of course, even more important was the archives. The archives and the library. They have copies of materials and original documents from all the world. So huge amounts of materials in many, many languages. And being able to be in a research institution like that, having access to so many archives in a relative short period of time in one place, was an absolute game changer for me. And also my habilitation, my postdoc, then I think reached a different level thanks to the support and the feedback of the colleagues also from the museum in workshops we had, where you present your research and so on. But also from other colleagues I got to know in Washington, D.C., because Washington, D.C. and the museum in particular is a place where people come together, people from all over the U.S. and Canada and Europe and beyond. And that's also true for Holocaust scholars. So that's a great place to be. It's kind of one big think tank, the Holocaust Museum, and the colleagues are extremely helpful there and supportive. And I'm still in touch with them to this very day. I still work together with the museum on various initiatives with Holocaust education, with oral history projects and archival projects and so on and so on. So absolutely important experience. Another game changer, actually, in my career, I would say, yes.
You said, and when you introduced yourself, that studying in New Orleans during your graduate program was a game changer in your career. What do you mean by that? And can you just further expand on? Like, how was your time in New Orleans?
Yeah, studying in New Orleans as a graduate student, as a young graduate student, was an absolute game changer for me. It was eye-opening. It pushed the windows open to the world, because until then, I was mostly used to my world in Italy and in Austria, but not to an international context, not to the English-speaking world, which is, of course, much, much bigger. And also the possibilities, if you publish, if you write in English, it opens a whole different level, a whole different world, literally, than just sticking to publishing something in Italian or German. That's one thing. Experiencing the US, learning about the US, being on a different continent for the first time in my life. Of course, now I'm much older. I've been to many continents since then, many other continents, but that was my first out of Europe experience. It really makes you much more mature and also not just professionally, but also personally. And it changes, this experiences changes you in a way. It makes you kind of more older, I would say, in a sense, because you get all these new experiences. You understand, how societies are different, the cultures are different, that values, how people see the world in other societies is different. Yeah, I knew that. I knew about that in theory, but not in practice, because my world was the Italian world and the Austrian world, and that was more or less it. So limited, and New Orleans really opened the window to the world. And also the American system, the American university system is very different. Certainly it was very different in the 1990s than the Central European and Italian university system was. In the US, there's a strong focus on working as a professor, working with your graduate students, spending a lot of time. Also a strong focus in teaching how they write, how they teach. Teaching is a strong focus for the education of graduate students in the United States. And in Europe, much less so. Also, back then, also has changed, of course, nowadays. But back then, that was not so much the case. And for me, it was really breathing fresh air. You had a chance to see these professors. The doors were open often. They had time. You could ask questions. The hierarchy was flat. That's how I felt. Yeah. And in Europe, it was different, much more traditional, and like up down ideas, just like the society, very different. And I greatly appreciated that. And that's something, I learned that really impacted me deeply. And now being a professor myself and being an advisor of PhD students and master students, and of course undergraduate students as well, I carry this on, right? I wanna give that to my students, what I was given. And without New Orleans, it's very possible that I would have never had this kind of experience. I would have never this exposure to a bigger world. I would never have maybe even thought about coming to the United States and living here and having a career here. So, Günther Bischoff completely changed my life in a way. It was not all him, but he certainly played a huge role in my life, in my career, but also personally in introducing me to a whole new, different world.
Okay, and then going off of that, he's going to finish off the generalized questions that we're asking all of our guests. So the first one is, what do you think of when you think of America?
I have many thoughts right now. But how many hours do we have? So we don't have probably 5-6 hours to discuss that. But United States, America, first of all, it's different from Europe. And the other thing that I want to say is that there is no perfect society. So in every society, there are, advantages and disadvantages, bright spots and dark spots. And the United States gives more opportunities, I think. Also, there is this concept in the United States of the American dream. I know that's overstressed, I understand. But the basic idea is that you can become American. Then you can reinvent yourself, that you can achieve your goals. You can aspire for something. You can aspire for more than your parents had or your grandparents had, generation, yeah? And that's what I understand. That's my interpretation of the American dream. And in Europe, we don't have an equivalent of the American. We don't have a European dream. Traditionally, Europeans cannot reinvent themselves. So once you're born Italian, you will always be Italian or Austrian, but you cannot really become Italian or Austrian, but you can become American. Although, of course, I know not everybody in the U.S. would agree to that, but there is a tradition of, inclusiveness. There's also the other traditions as well, of course, I understand. But there's one tradition, of you can become part of it. You can become, you can be included. And in Europe, there's the strong tradition of ethnic nationalism, which is very exclusive. You can never become. You either are or you're not. You can never, you can do what you want. Like, it's not about your action. It means nothing. You can, it's given by nature, by birth, basically. And also Europe, this idea that you can achieve, that you should aspire for higher, is a relatively new idea. In Europe, it's more like, that's my interpretation. It's how I grew up. Probably nowadays it's different. I understand that. But in my generation, the traditional thinking was you should stay where you belong. In other words, if your parents were lower middle class, that's where you belong, and you shouldn't aspire for anything high. If you do, it's a negative thing. It's rather sinful. So it's a very different culture, very different tradition. And so when I think of America, those are one of the first things that come to my mind. Of course, many others, but yes, this is one of the first things that comes to mind.
But in bouncing off of that, what do you think of when you think of Austria?
When I think of Austria, I think of nature. I'm from Tyrol, from the mountains, from the Italian-Austrian border, and so therefore Austria has a lot to do with the mountains for me, and nature and history, of course. Because not everyone from Austria is from Vienna. Have to make this clear and remind everyone, because I get this question: you're from Vienna? No, not everyone is from Vienna. And Austria, I think, is also a country that's often misunderstood. It has, of course, many issues, many shortcomings, like any society. Again, there's no perfect society. Austrian society is far from being perfect, but there's some very positive elements as well, and many benefits for living in the Austrian society. People are fortunate, I think, to live in Austria with the security that we still have, given everything that's going on in our world nowadays, and the nature and the healthcare system and social welfare state and all those things. But I think Austria is often misunderstood, especially its history, because most people, not just outside of Austria, know very little about Austrian history or Austria in general. So people know more about, especially in the United States, Germany. They know Germany kind of, or think they know, or have an idea, some knowledge or some stereotypes, but they don't know very much about Austria. And then with a little knowledge of Germany, trying to explain the complexities of Austrian history and identity, this is not going to fly. You're not going to understand that. But that's what I see often people are trying to do. So when I think of Austria, I think also of the complexities of its history and how misunderstood this history and identity often is.
Awesome. The second to last question I have is, what is your favorite American food?
Define American food.
That is a good question.
Pizza.
Pizza?
No, I mean, joking aside, I think America is a mix of all kinds of influences in the American society. And especially when it comes to food, that's true, but it's also true for Europe, because there is no such thing than a national food, a national dish. This is a construction, basically, of the 19th century. It has to do with the history of nationalism, right? And food is traditionally local or regional and not national. A pizza is from Naples, 200 years ago, nobody in Northern Italy knew what a pizza is. That's a very recent thing. And I think pizza, especially Chicago style or New York style, also became an American thing, because things change. There's a constant exchange and mix and conversation of knowledge of food, of ingredients of food. And so that's how I understand it. So in other words, I love that to be in America, because it has all this diversity. I'm a big fan of diversity. Life is just more interesting, and food is much more interesting if you have diversity and don't have to eat all day long the same thing, or you have 5 different dishes and that's it. So I feel very fortunate in that sense to be living in the United States, because you have all these options. And there are also places in the United States where you can, believe it or not, you get Tyrolean food or food items, not always easy to find, but if you know how and where, it's possible. And I love food and its diversity, and America, United States, is a wonderful place for that.
And so going off of you're saying, food is more of a local or regional topic. What is your favorite New Orleans?
Oh my God. Also New Orleans, of course, is a good example for all these different influences, right? From Europe, from Africa, from the Caribbean, from the Americas. It all came together to blend in this unique New Orleans or Louisiana style cuisines, plural, And as a student, I liked, catfish a lot, and with French fries, all things not very healthy. But I mean, one thing to keep in mind, I was a graduate student. I didn't have much money. I'm not from a rich family. I'm not from a well-off family. So I was in New Orleans, and I couldn't go to the more special or more expensive food places. But I appreciate it very much that in New Orleans there was good coffee. And in the 1990s, good coffee in the U.S. was rare. Don't want to offend anyone, but you couldn't get good coffee at any, every street corner back then. And in New Orleans, there were a number of places which had very good coffee, and so I appreciated that a lot. I liked all kinds of seafood, so everything with shrimp I like, and so I enjoyed that a lot, because as a Tyrolean, seafood is not a thing we normally have, traditionally at least, on the table. And so I was really eager to eat as much as seafood and fish I could get my hands on with the little money I had while I was a student in New Orleans. And it was wonderful. So the history there and the food, wonderful experience.
Hey, well, that's about it.
All the best. Take care.
Have a good day.
Good luck.
Danke fürs Dabeisein.
Thanks for listening. We hope you'll tune in to the next episode. More information can be found at Center Austria's website, www.centeraustria.org.
Und auf der Homepage des Instituts für Zeitgeschichte der Universität Innsbruck, www.uibk.ac.at/Zeitgeschichte.